All right, today I have Victoria joining me. I am so excited to get into this conversation with you today as a cross-cultural communications consultant and coach. I've had an opportunity to have a few conversations with you offline. I love the intel that you bring into this space, as organizations continue to go more and more global and have multilingual employees in the mix. And I've supported some myself. I think this is just such a great opportunity to learn a bit more and to share some of that insight, with the LinkedIn community as a whole. So first of all, I want to shoot it over to you quickly and just give you a chance to introduce yourself.
Thanks so much, MJ. I'm really excited to chat with you about this. Yeah, for over 10 years now, I have done this work mostly with one-to-one coaching clients and more recently with multicultural teams. And it's a very near and dear topic to my heart. I'm also multicultural in many different ways, you could say. I'm an immigrant to Canada. I've moved here when I was 5 years old, so I was raised in a Polish household and very much felt that tension my entire life of what it feels like living in a culture that's different than the outside culture. And to make things more fun, I would spend summers with my dad, who was Greek and lived in Greece. So I was very culturally all over the place. And of course, this fueled my interest in my professional field, which eventually I got a master's degree in speech language pathology. And after a few years working in that space, I started my business doing this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think that's what's so special about you is that you do have that personal experience of navigating multilingual environments and trying to go from one to the other. And how do you kind of make it all work and fit for you? So today I would love to ask some questions that I have personally, kind of an opportunity to be coached by you directly, but also questions that I know some of the people I support or even just people in the broader context might have. One that comes to mind off the hop is, as a native English speaker, I think we can be relatively naive to some of the challenges that our non-native speaker counterparts might be facing or having. I'm curious, from your perspective, what would you say are one or two of the biggest challenges that they face that would be helpful for us native speakers to be aware of?
I think that the biggest one is that non-native English speakers are facing so many forms of uncertainty. And of course, our brain processes all of that. So not only are they literally processing with more energy because they're speaking and communicating in their non-native language, which already decreases the threshold at which you get into the fight or flight response. There are also so many unwritten rules to navigate regarding like something as simple as the language itself, like the vowel system or the pronunciation. That is a huge stressor for people, let alone the cultural factors and the behaviors that are appropriate or not as socially appropriate in a North American context. So I think it's really important to realize that someone is navigating not just what we see, like the tip of the iceberg, but they're navigating so many things. And if that person happens to be an immigrant, or even more so a recent immigrant, well, then they are navigating a culture shock and moves and probably lots of legal stuff. So depending on the very specific person and their journey, they may be navigating so much more than we're possibly even anticipating. And even in a way, like maybe even more than they are aware of, because our brain takes that all on. And sometimes we feel like we're spinning out of control, but we don't even know exactly why.
Yeah. I mean, even just the awareness of that, right? We know like our perspective shapes our reality. So for us, if
Mhm.
it comes naturally, we wouldn't even take a second to consider that. So maybe the first step is just putting yourself in those shoes. If you were in, a foreign country or having to speak a non-native language in a work context, what might some of those challenges look and feel like for you? But given that that's the reality, is there anything in terms of what you feel we could do as native speakers to maybe help alleviate some of that tension and challenge that non-native speakers are facing?
Yeah, that's a great question, MJ. I think from a leadership standpoint, I think the more we can do to be a very organized leader, which obviously we would want every leader to be organized, but the less overwhelm that we're introducing into the workspace, the more beneficial it's going to be for our multicultural employees, because like I said, they're already processing a lot. So being very intentional to be very clear about what the expectations are to, to really lead in an optimal way and from an organizational standpoint, I think would be very beneficial to the person's literal brain and how they're able to go through the motions of making sense of the expectations. So trying to be very intentional as well. I think how we can interact with folks from different cultures. I think two big things come to mind. The first is that like having the knowledge and awareness that we constantly all operate from our own belief systems and past experiences. You could consider them biases if that's the word that you want to use. But for better and for worse, our brain is a pattern machine, right? It's always looking to figure something out with the least amount of energy. And so I think it's really important, both like for someone in a leadership position, or if we're talking about a coworker or even a friend, to realize that we have to get out of autopilot to have successful cross-cultural communication, because someone's behaviors and words and voice patterns from a different culture are signaling different things to us than they mean to them. And so if we're in autopilot, and actually I'll give you a personal example in a second, but if we're not like taking the time to pause and reflect and realize that, then we're interpreting their message inaccurately, guaranteed 95% of the time or even higher. I'll give you a funny example though, from a personal standpoint. We're a multilingual household, and I speak Polish to my kids, and Polish has a very different vocal and tonality pattern, which is very much falling, which to an American ear sounds more assertive and or aggressive. And if I was only using English, obviously those patterns would dissipate. But where I use Polish all the time in the house, a lot of the miscommunications that I have with my husband, who is a native English speaker, are about my tonality. And he'll say, gosh, you sound really harsh in saying that. And it really took us years to discover that I believe it's the influence of my using Polish on a really regular basis that just kind of spills over into that. And this is me who has like really big awareness of this as a topic. You can still fall into the trap of being like, well, that's just my tonality. But to my husband, I was signaling like, I'm mad at you or I'm being aggressive when I was not trying to be those things. So in a workplace, of course, the stakes are higher. You don't necessarily feel that you can share those kind of things with your coworker. Hey, your tone sounds a little bit sharp. But so pausing, and when we hear a certain tone of voice, or when someone is using words towards us that we're like, whoa, that was a bit abrasive, to have the curiosity about the fact that maybe those weren't meant in a negative way, I think is really important.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so happy you touched on that. The curiosity as opposed to the judgment. The other two themes I hear in what you share is empathy. Again, the importance of consideration of what might be going on from their perspective or their lens. And then the idea of not assuming intent, right? Or understanding that intent doesn't always mean impact. Because I think, again, our perspective shapes our reality. So if I'm delivering something with my own intent in mind, I can't just assume that the impact is going to match my intent. And that's where the curiosity allows us, right, to better understand what is their perspective. Yes, I intend it to land this way, but I also have to consider how it's going to be received in order to be clear on the impact that it's going to have.
Exactly. And it's funny because when I started this work, MJ, if you had 10 years ago said like mindset is going to be a really big thing that you need to touch on with your clients, I would have looked at you like, no, no, no. It has to do with pronunciation and like very technical things. And over the years, the more clients I've seen and the more I've seen patterns, and now I teach it very directly from the outset. But I think that's why I love your post so much. It's really the mindset piece is everything. I'll give you a quick example. One of my very early clients, very lovely Japanese lady who had moved here, I don't remember at this point, but had been here a while, and she shared with me, she said, my accent is holding me back from my next promotion. And she was not so easy to understand that I took that completely at face value. I didn't question it. I said, let's get to work. Let's work on your pronunciation. And as time went on and I got to know her a bit better, do you know what she shared with me, MJ? that she didn't apply for any opportunities because she believed that her accent would hold her back from opportunities. So that's a very, very different solution, right? Or at least the first step of that solution would have to do with mindset and beliefs and the behaviors downstream of that. And getting to the technical side may have given her the confidence, but I don't think that's necessarily the first piece. And actually, with my clients and with teams, I don't teach the technical speech and language piece as the first piece anymore at all. That's actually more so towards the end, and I find that to be much more effective for that very reason. Yeah.
What a vivid example. Yeah, because you're right? Like the change doesn't happen when we focus on the behaviors. The change happens by getting curious and understanding what those beliefs are, right? And I think that's a challenge with a lot of training is that you bring someone in and we talk about behaviors and do this and do that and don't do this and start doing this, but the beliefs are what really drive the actions and the decisions that we're making, which is what you're alluding to. So I'm actually very curious, having done this work for a while now, what are some of the common mistakes or misguided behaviors that people will turn to as, let's say, first a non-native speaker when they're in an organization that's multilingual? Like, are there certain trends or behaviors or actions that you see them inclined to take that don't benefit them, yet they're automatically ingrained to do or say these things?
Yeah, interesting. So I think it's very dependent as well on I get some clients who, when we talk about the cultural piece, they say, listen, part of why I left where I'm from is because I felt a misalignment with the culture and the values. So a client like that may have very different downstream behaviors compared to somebody who moved here, for example, because they believed they would have a better life for their children, but they actually like really love and maybe very much miss their native culture. And so again, part of it is our intentionality, but in general, I think that this is kind of what we already touched on, but I think a big part of it is also that we earlier were talking about not assuming things. And I think if we are going to assume anything, it is to assume positive intent in people's actions. And I know that sounds perhaps like cliche or cheesy, but I have friends, like I'm lucky enough to have friends across different ethnicities and religions and politics, shockingly. And once you really get to know someone deeply, you see that, okay, all this rhetoric, all this whatever, these people may have values that differ from ours. They do have values that are important to them. And I think when we think of it through the lens of someone is always operating to show their values. Like, let's assume everyone is trying their best. I think within a multicultural team, we can look at somebody and realize that this behavior that we're seeing, it's linked to a positive attribute more than likely, and it may be a value that we also hold, but maybe we don't hold it as our primary value, and so our downstream behavior would be different. Did that answer your question? I feel I got a little bit on a tangent.
Yeah. Well, I think again, I think the key thing I take away there is the assumption of positive intent. I listened to a great podcast the other day that kind of ties to this, and it was saying, listen, every human inherently wants to be seen as smart, capable, and good. And even just understanding that universal truth that connects us as a starting point, as opposed to starting by the beliefs that we don't align on. Like,
Yeah.
what are some of maybe the deeper held beliefs that we all hold as humans? And if we connect on those first, it can make us more resilient and open to accepting the differences along the way, right? And I suppose like the language or the cross-cultural differences as well, starting from that place of unity and assuming good intent, I think can probably help with some of that. I'm also curious because I think, again, as a native speaker, right, my lens is skewed, like we are all subjective in nature. When you work with non-native speakers, are there any particular points of conflict or frustration they report in terms of dealing with native speakers? Like, what are some of the ways in which maybe we're not showing up the best, but we're not necessarily aware of the impact of the way in which we're showing up?
Yeah. Ooh, there's so many ways I could go with this question. I think a big one, especially as it relates, of course, I work with a lot of Quebecois who are not immigrants. So that's why, in case you're thinking like, who are you working with that's not a native English speaker who lives in North America? But so if I'm looking at my group who are immigrants, they often, again, have a complex history, and a lot of native speakers often broach subjects that, if you were born and raised here, would not be a big deal at all, but not to all, obviously, but to many immigrants, some of those topics, they poke at very personal journeys with possibly, of course, trauma or just like heaviness to them. I'll give you an example that I hear overwhelmingly often is a native speaker in a friendly manner saying to someone like, "Hey, so and so, like, I can hear you're not from around here, so where are you from?" And people detest that question. They view it as incredibly invasive, and they view it as a sign that they don't belong. And so I think as native English speakers, which I'm pointing to myself, even though I learned English when I was 5, but for all intents and purposes, it's very easy to try to bridge the gap and get to know somebody. But again, even if we have the best of intentions, we have to be sensitive to the fact that, like, okay, let's make like 3 assumptions about this person who moved here. If they left their home country, perhaps there were reasons, and perhaps they don't want to get into it, and perhaps they don't want to get into it the first conversation you're ever having with them. I did a TEDx talk recently, and I touched on this, and someone in the audience afterwards came up to me and said, "This was such a great point. And so how and when should I ask the person where they're from?" And I said, "That's the whole point, is that maybe we don't ask ever, you know? Like, you kind of have to earn the right to dig deeper, just like I didn't meet you and say, 'So MJ, like, tell me about your family life or something more personal.' You know, that would be a
Yeah.
little unusual. And it's the same thing. But so I think having the awareness that what is super casual to us, being like raised in a certain culture, is may not be true for someone else.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that point, and I love that example because you're right. I mean, we have to understand that as humans, we're naturally curious, right? And we want answers to our own questions. But I think
Mhm.
to understand, again, the bigger context at play, I don't know why, but the example that came to mind when you were sharing that was almost like if you were to go on a first date with someone and like your first
Mhm.
question is like, "So tell me about your ex." And it's like, I don't, like I don't know that that's going to resonate. And again, I think
Yeah.
it's, what's the purpose of the question you're asking, right? Are we
Mhm.
looking to build connection and make this person feel like they belong? Or are we
Yes.
looking to just scratch our own curiosity itch? Because the
Yes.
approach and the impact can be much different, right? Depending on that. Which
I
I
love how you
suppose,
phrased that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that sort of leads me into my next question, which is, there are a lot of leaders I've supported and continue to support many leaders who lead multinational, multilingual teams. If someone is stepping into a new leadership role of a multilingual team, what would
Mhm.
you say is maybe the best place to start in terms of building effective communication within the team? Maybe just one or two quick hit tips in terms of
Yeah.
things they can do off the hop to improve the communication.
Yeah, I think getting the team aligned in terms of having clear expectations and like to unearth our own biases, to even just kind of to talk about some of the points we talked about, even briefly, I think is so eye-opening for so many people to be like, listen, we're all operating through our own lens, and we're obviously a very diverse group here. And so let's all give each other the benefit of the doubt. Let's ask for extra clarification. Let's not jump to conclusions, to set it up in a very open and supportive way that supports curiosity, and obviously to lead by example as well. I think it also makes a difference if, if 8 team members are of the same culture and there's one team member from a different culture. That's also a very different dynamic than often, the whole team is very multicultural. So making sure that nobody feels singled out is, I think, very important, so that person doesn't carry the burden of the whole team's communication dynamics just because they happen to not be a native speaker or to have been raised somewhere else.
Yeah. Well, and even as you're saying that, I'm considering situations where maybe the leader is the person in a different country and the
Yeah,
team is located elsewhere, but the same advice applies. I think that's really good.
but
Okay,
it's still
so
tricky, MJ, because we tend to, even if we have the awareness, like the idea of unknown unknowns, like even if we think we're addressing things, at the end of the day, I think we have to constantly check up on ourselves and constantly analyze, are things really going well? Because we we just don't know what we don't know. I'm sure this is a big part of your practice. We just don't know. And so even like as I'm currently navigating a situation in a different country, I know the culture, I know that there are cultural differences, but still there are such big pillars that are just completely unknown to me that I still am often faced with big communication roadblocks because I keep encountering things that I didn't expect. So kind of expect the unexpected. And I think when that's our expectation, that maybe, there will be some bumps in the road until the team dynamic is established, and that's okay.
yeah. Well, and I think so much of that ties to our expectations of ourselves, right? Again, from the mindset lens, it's the question of what does it mean about me to not know, right?
Mhm.
It's better for our ego at times to assume that we do know, right? Or tell ourselves that story. Whereas you're right, a lot of the growth and the ability to build meaningful connection requires us to embrace that we don't know what we don't know. And that is an ongoing process, right? So I think that's a really good point to make. Another one I have is we live in a very virtual world these days, and there's different ways in which people can communicate, right?
Mm.
So we've got emails, we've got Slack or text messages, we have virtual face to face. Probably my least favorite is the virtual black box with a name in it, two black
Mm.
box with a name in it, which I know some of my leaders in corporate spaces are navigating. And we have face to face communication. But I'm curious if you have any tips or guidance in terms of which means of communication is best,
Mm.
depending on what it is you're looking to communicate with another person.
That's such a cool question, MJ. I think that, like with any interaction, we have to consider what's the purpose of that given communication. And especially North American culture and our norms, typically there's some sort of dance between goal-driven communication and relationship-based communication. And I think we need to think about the medium when we decide how to send a message. So, for example, you'll notice often on LinkedIn when someone is trying to like get friendly with you, for better and for worse, they'll send a voice note because a voice note is more personal than a little written message. Especially with, I won't even say the dawn, but the boom of AI at this point, where everything is like, is this a bot? Is this a real comment? Is this a real email? I think definitely if you want to show someone that you are a real person and show that there's real personalization, you can't, like, the less offline you can get it, or the more you can make it, the more you're driving the relationship. And sometimes it doesn't matter, right? Like the other day I had some sort of support question. I don't really care to make some great connection with the support person, nor do they care to connect with me. So then it's like, hey, I'm having X problem. Here's a solution to your problem. It can be text-based. There's no relationship building expected. And if I want to get to know you, well, a virtual call, if we don't live nearby, is certainly better than a call in which I don't see you. And I know this touches on, different issues with folks not feeling comfortable, especially in team meetings. But if we're talking with like a boss or a new friend and we want to show that this is really to build our relationship, the more, what's the word I'm looking for? The more you can make it mimic a face-to-face non-virtual interaction, I think the more cues that we're able to receive that this is a person I like and trust. You can see my facial expressions and or hear my voice in a voice note. So I think really thinking about whether we are building the relationship or whether we're not. And even if it's someone with whom we're building a relationship, like a coworker, if it's really like a goal specific inquiry, like if you have a, hey, did you finish the report? You don't necessarily need to send a voice note about that if you're expecting a yes or no. But if it's something deeper, then I think the more we can make it mimic the offline world, the more we can build that relationship.
Yeah. Well, and I think especially in the context of work, right, where you do have a long-standing relationship, it's important to embrace that both of those are valuable, right? I would presume,
Mhm.
and correct me if I'm wrong, but just to have goal-based communication without the relationship-based communication might put a damper on the performance or the productivity over time.
100%.
Would you have any advice, I suppose, in terms of how a non-native speaker could lean into building that relationship communication strategy for themselves and why it would be beneficial for them to do so?
I think when I think of many of my clients, maybe I'm thinking like even upstream of your question, but it's to get out of the so many of my clients express fear of judgment, and that's why they don't initiate a relationship because they had a few bad experiences in which, the signals were crossed. And so then they're in a state of hiding and they don't try. And so it's really to question our assumptions about what someone else is going to judge us about, and to frankly either decide that maybe I'm wrong, maybe this person won't be judging me at all, or to decide, you know what, if you're going to be judging me in my second or third language, like I frankly don't care, right? Like at this point in my life, I'm really on team I don't care. And so to allow ourselves to break out of our fear very intentionally. Again, I know that sounds cliche, but when it comes down to it, fear of judgment really sabotages a lot of non-native English speakers, or folks, non-native whatever speakers. Like I live in Quebec, so I have to use French on a daily basis. It's certainly not my most proficient language. It's not as strong as my English. And so you have to keep, flexing that muscle and practicing so that you can even give yourself the chance to build the relationship. If you're always too afraid to even try, then I can guarantee you won't build the relationship. And if you try a bunch of times and maybe some of the attempts are really failed and you're like, wow, that didn't go as expected, well then you learn from that and then you reattempt. And I think, again, without sounding cliche, because I really believe this with my whole being, there are like wonderful relationships on the other side of the attempt, but we do have to put in the effort.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and again, it circles back to mindset, right? That our
Mhm.
brain will want the path of least resistance. If it's more comfortable staying status quo and avoiding and not engaging with other people at will, yet there is a long-term cost that's quite heavy that's associated with always choosing that short-term gain or pleasure, right? Whereas on the
100%.
flip side, yes, this may be uncomfortable in this moment for me to do this simply because the brain's not used to me doing it, right? Anytime we try something new that's unfamiliar, the brain's going to be like, wait a second, should we? Yet, as you're saying, on the other side of that discomfort is the opportunity to build meaningful connections, right? To build your own confidence, to network, to create opportunities, all of these things that ultimately they're really looking to go and grow after, right? So I think it's really important for us to remind ourselves that sometimes we want to think our way into a new way of acting, but there's so much power to acting our way into a new way of thinking and giving ourselves permission to do that. So I really love that you mentioned that.
Yeah, and even to take it a step further, our brain, if we're thinking in terms of brain science, our brain can get trapped in overwhelm, go into shutdown. But by setting this small goal for ourselves, we're also, we're pinging our nervous system at a different point, the part where, the good chemicals are released, and we're like, hey, I set this goal and I achieved this goal, even if it's something as small as saying hello to whomever, So I think it also can very much support our nervous system and foster that future connection.
Yes, yes. The idea of starting small and doing that thing. And again, like you said, tracking the proof and evidence that, hey, I did
Mm.
it and I survived. Like I'm here to talk about it, right? Because again, that's giving your brain proof and evidence that this thing that it perceives as very scary and dangerous actually may not be. But we don't know that until we're willing to take that step and build that proof and evidence.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think folks assume that it'll take a really long time, but when we're literally working on our mindset and taking those actions, you can radically, and I'm sure you've seen this time and time again, you can radically transform how you show up in a really small period of time if you really embrace that new belief and act on it. So I think also for the people listening to know that it doesn't have to be like months of pain and torture. You can really start getting the fruits of your efforts quite quickly.
Yeah. Yes. Very, very true. Well, listen, Victoria, it has been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate you taking the time to jump on and share some of your insight. If anyone would like to find you, where could they do that?
I'm on LinkedIn, Victoria Patenaude, and my website is accentography.com.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, MJ.